it's great to hear that you are collectively very interested in that period of time as well. I actually was going to tell you about a conference in May, so hopefully the conference that I was going to mention and yours is not the same weekend, but we can talk about that later on. So I'll go into screen share now, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so can you see my slides? Good. All right. Well, without further ado, quarter-life crisis, an overview of research and theory. So the way I'm going to structure this is just talk about developmental crisis more generally and what I mean by it. And so there's a fair amount of heritage in terms of the meaning that I will suggest. Then we'll look at some quantitative studies and correlates in terms of prevalence and post-crisis growth, how it relates to curiosity and reading behavior, how it relates to authenticity, and qualitative studies, and where I will talk about the dual typology of quarter-life crisis that you may have read about in my book or books, locked out and locked in crisis, and we'll talk about those and how they manifest and how they can combine as well, and why it might be that it's those particular structures or forms that are so indicative of this kind of crisis. So that's how it'll pan out, and then we'll do questions at the end. So starting off, what is a developmental crisis episode? Well, I guess the foundational assumption of the idea behind a developmental crisis episode goes all the way back beyond Erik Erikson to Carl Jung, and to the tradition of lifespan development that was started by Jung and carried on by Erikson and others, which views human life as one that is an inevitable movement between periods of stability and periods of instability, with the unstable periods, the periods of instability from time to time, initiating a crisis episode, which is inevitably difficult to go through, but maybe extremely formative developmentally. So this relates to an idea which, as I say, goes back to Jung and probably further, which is that it might not be a good idea to be happy all the time, and that it may be developmentally optimal to pass between periods where you feel unusually distressed but unusually open to change, as well as periods of stability and happiness where the primary motive will be to continue what you're doing because it seems to be working and making you feel good. And this is important because, you know, there tends to be a strong emphasis in psychology these days on being satisfied and being happy. But that, for me, is one side of a coin. You need to consider it in relation to its opposite. And a developmental crisis episode I define as an episode of life typically lasting at least a year, so not a minor hassle, which contains the following characteristics. So it's felt to be a turning point, an important time of transition, a time of instability and disintegration, so feelings of being fragmented or in pieces. Of course, human beings are composed of many parts, both physically and mentally, and in periods of stability, we feel an overriding sense of singular wholeness. We feel like we're one person. But in times of instability and crisis, we may feel like there are competing parts of ourselves that are sort of battling against each other, or we may feel fragmented. And that's simply because, you know, in those times, you are simply less unified. Feelings of being overwhelmed and struggling to cope using current coping strategies. And that's a key stimulus for change, because if your current coping strategies aren't working, you need to look for new ones. Struggles with negative emotion and distress. And again, this is an important mechanism for change. There is no stronger stimulus for change than feeling bad. A negative emotion provides a powerful stimulus for change because it's aversive and we want to get rid of it. And, you know, there's in sort of simple terms, feeling good makes you want to carry on what you're doing, and feeling bad makes you want to change. And human beings are creatures of habit and often need that stimulus for change. There's a period of intensive questioning of yourself, your life situation, and what life means. So rather than feel like you've got all the answers, Your mind is full of questions, and that is again adaptive. And I put that it releases the human potential, and that simply means that whatever your potential is as a person, your possibility, what you can conceivably be in the future, the only way you release that is through experimentation and change. You don't release it by staying the same. And what we see in developmental crisis is a lot of trying things out, a lot of experimentation, and a lot of change, for the reasons I've just described. And the Chinese character for crisis, interestingly, has two characters in it, which means danger and opportunity. And I like that, how that captures the two sides of a crisis episode. The time of danger, but a time of opportunity. So that's the sort of big picture on that. But then we're going to, but in terms of quarter life crisis, so crisis episodes that tend to occur in the first decade of adulthood, they are certainly very common, and but they can be, if navigated in the right way, very developmentally functional and formative. I personally had a quarter life crisis, which was absolutely essential insofar as everything I do now as an academic and in terms of my lifestyle and what I do is it started then. Prior to that crisis, I was a market research executive working for a company. But the stimulus for change that led in this direction occurred during the quarter life crisis I had in my around 26, 27. Happy to talk about that later. If you want to know more, ask me in the questions. So quarter life crisis, it happens in this very, very challenging period of the lifespan when young adults are making major decisions about what they're going to do in the future. And it's a period of decision making with long-term consequences that you don't get to the same extent in other parts of the lifespan. But let's look at the quantitative stuff first. So how often does it happen, and what kind of things does it correlate with? Well, I've just recently published an article with Nikolai Petrov and Jeff Arnett, where we developed a questionnaire which measures developmental crisis. Maybe some of you might have seen this. It's in the Journal of Adult Development. And we're going to be doing an international study in terms of getting some prevalence estimates and developing and evaluating this measure. So we should definitely consider getting your group involved in that. But in terms of the study, so I developed this measure, which is a 12-item measure of crisis with 3 subscales, which relates to the definition I've just given you. You can see the subscales at the bottom: disconnection and distress, lack of clarity and control, and transition and turning point. So there's 4 items for each subscale. And the idea really is that for a person who's in crisis, they should show fairly strong scores on all subscales, in that a crisis is the meeting of the 3. But I'm just going to share with you now, I mean, the article is full of psychometric evaluation, but I'll just share what we got by way of prevalence estimates from this in relation to quarter life crisis. So what we did was we established through a variety of means a cutoff score of 42 out of 60 for the presence of crisis. And this means that the individual has to have at least 14 across the subscales, and a subscale score of 14 means scoring above the midpoint on individual items on average. So it's we found that it was the best way of having a kind of categorical cutoff for the purposes of saying, is someone in crisis or not? And based on that for the sample we had, which was broadly UK based, for young adults and midlifers and later life, well, so you can see broken down by gender and age group, you can see here what we found. It's an interesting one, and what I can't say, by the way, is that these are particularly robust prevalence estimates. But it's the first study we've done with this questionnaire, and we'll be moving towards nationally representative samples. But we found 25% of females, young adult females in crisis, and 16% of males. But that extends beyond quarter life crisis, I should say, that age grouping. It's sort of young adult crisis all the way up through 30s as well. Midlife, the midlife group, which is actually 40 to 59, that's a typo. We only had 9% of females in crisis and 25% of males in crisis, which is very interesting. So much higher proportion of midlife crisis in men. And in the later life group, we had no females within the sample reporting a crisis and 5% of males, so much lower there. So if we were to add those up across the genders, then the highest proportion is young adults, but that's because of the fact that there were fewer females in midlife. So what we could say is that using this psychometric measure and with this particular cutoff point, which is by no means absolute, a large proportion of people report being in crisis at any particular time, around, well, let's say a quarter of females and just less than 1 in 5 men. So this is not a small and peripheral number of people going through crisis. If you think this is a snapshot at any one time, and the fact that these last a year anyway, I think. Oh, sorry, we've got a bit of noise coming in there. Do mute yourselves.
Sorry.
Now, in terms of the gender differences, again, so the aim is to continue to get a further sample in the UK and across. We're going to be aiming about 7 to 9 countries in terms of getting young adult samples, because the next study will be focused purely on young adults in quarter life crisis. So I'm pleased that we've developed this measure, because we now have an interval level data measure that we can take forward to get some indications of what crisis relates to and how much of it there is. This is a study that I did with Gordon Wright, where we looked not only at prevalence of crisis episode, but this was retrospective prevalence, asking people past the age of 30, for example, do you think you had a crisis in your 20s? So we got really quite a large proportion of people retrospectively saying that. It's about 30% of people said that they thought they had a crisis in their 20s, for example. But I'm going to show you the features which we found in this data set, which are rather interesting across males and females. We said, so tell us about what, samples about 1,000. And we said, to those 1,000 people, tell us what happened during the crisis. And these are the features that we found. So in terms of the male sample, you can see the most prevalent features were as follows: feeling trapped in a job you don't want to be in anymore, experiencing a high level of stress and pressure in your job, or an unwanted period of unemployment. Again, this was in the young adult group. And then under that, you further features debt, financial difficulties, divorce or relationship breakup, bereavement, death of a person close to you, family conflict or dispute, uncertainty or confusion in your own beliefs or worldview, change of career, and being locked into a relationship you no longer wanted to be in. So you can see here some of the features which came out in the qualitative work about feeling trapped, feeling locked in, and particularly with this kind of difficult dynamic about me and my work and me and my relationships, fitting myself in with these social systems of home, friends, work, and feeling ensnared, feeling somehow like rather than work and relationships are allowing my personality out, they're holding it in, and I feel trapped. So this, and we can see a similar but different with the female group in this very large sample. Divorce or relationship breakup was number 1 in the female sample. Debt or financial difficulties was, well, it's pretty much identical in terms of prevalence to the male group. You can see 29.5, 29.2, but these items are just generally lower frequency in the female group, so very similar. Being locked into a relationship you no longer want to be in is the 3rd, and then we've got family conflict, bereavement. 23% reporting an abusive relationship, whether that was mentally or physically, we don't know, but the fact remains that that's quite shocking. Feeling trapped in a job you don't want to be in, high level of stress and pressure, So again, you can see that for both groups, it's a slightly different emphasis in terms of which are top, with the female group being a bit more relationship focused and the male group being a bit more work focused. But the picture is common across them, which is one of a sort of pressure cooker of being in a circumstance which feels entrapping, being like you're locked into it. Difficulties with breaking out of commitments. So there's kind of instability of changing jobs, feeling unemployed, breaking out of a relationship, and problematic relationships, whether that's abusive or conflictual or otherwise. So I feel like that this quantitative data certainly paints an interesting picture. And again, with the caveat, of course, that this is UK data. I'd love to get this kind of data from other countries as well. Let's go on to this other element of the data, which was post-crisis growth. So let me just talk you through this graph. So what I did for the purpose of this graph is there's a 5-point scale, but I've combined disagree and strongly disagree into a percentage. So the proportion of people who disagreed, then there's the midpoint, neither agree nor disagree, and then agree or strongly agree on the right. And there were 4 things we asked people in this study about post-crisis growth. We said, okay, so you had a crisis. For those of you who reported one, do you think it made you a stronger person? Do you think it led to an increase in your self-esteem? Do you think it led to positive changes in your lifestyle, which is the green line? Do you think your quality of life improved as a result, which is the purple line? So blue line, stronger person, red line, self-esteem increase, positive change lifestyle, green line, purple line, quality of life improved. So if you have a look at the graph, you can see that around 45 to 65% reported, yes, I think that in these 4 ways, things have got better following the crisis, that it's been a catalyst for positive change. I'm stronger, self-esteem's improved, my lifestyle's better, etc. Then around 20% on every item said don't know, neither agree nor disagree. And then around 18 to 38% reported no, I think I don't agree with that. In other words, saying things have got worse. And the highest one there was the self-esteem line. You can see the red line. Almost 40% said, actually, no, my self-esteem has not increased. I disagree. And so what this emphasizes, this graph captures in a kind of graphic form a vital feature of crisis, which is that it is not necessarily going to lead to positive change going through a crisis. For the majority, it will. Well, I say the majority. For a large proportion, it will. But for a minority proportion, it won't. So a crisis is like a fork in the road, and it's an opportunity for growth. But I've already told you it's a dangerous and difficult period as well. And if it isn't responded to in the right way and changes aren't made that allow for that release of potential, it can lead to continued difficulties as well. And that's certainly something we found in our qualitative research too. However, I'll tell you something interesting about doing qualitative research with interviews. And this is something that you can consider yourself when you're doing interview-based research. What we tend to find with our interview-based research is that people who come forward to talk for an hour or approximately about a crisis that they have had generally have a positive story to tell. So they want to tell you about a time of transformation where things were difficult but things improved, and there is a self-selecting bias in qualitative research, and that people tend to come forward who have a positive outcome. This is much less so when you're doing these kind of survey studies, which are easy and anonymous. You tend to get all kinds of people responding, so you get more of the people who maybe had a difficult time coming out of crisis. So we were in another study, I related crisis to authenticity and curiosity. And I'll tell you about the findings from that now. There's also a different prevalence data because we used a a simple single question and said, do you think this applies to you, this definition of crisis? Yes, definitely, maybe, or no. So in terms of prevalence, we got 20% of the total group of 20 to 35-year-olds saying, yes, I'm definitely in a crisis, which is pretty similar in terms of sort of evening it out from the, very similar actually, from the study we did with the new psychometric measure, the DCQ-12. But then we've got a very large proportion going maybe, around 30% of males and females, and more actually. So there's many in that who you know, if you ask people, you know, are you hovering around a developmental crisis? A lot of people say yes. So again, really reinforcing that you know, the life for young adults is a kind of balance between these periods of instability and stability. Now, in terms of authenticity, we predicted that those who'll be struggling with quarter-life crisis will show lower levels of authenticity, because they'll feel that sense of disintegration, that they may have a sense of, this is who I am inwardly, but this is who I am outwardly, and those are not the same thing at the moment. For some reason, I'm in a job which does not match my personality, and so, you know, and I'm having to kind of put on an act or whatever else, where they feel that disjunct between inner and outer, or different parts of themselves. And we found exactly that. For those who are definitely in a crisis, they reported lower levels of authenticity than those who thought they were maybe in a crisis, who reported lower levels of authenticity than those who said that they weren't. And that's the difference between those was significant, so p less than 0.001. So that was very much what we expected, and I think that's a fairly replicable finding and quite an easy finding to replicate, particularly now that we've got our new psychometric measure. And by the way, we measured authenticity with the authenticity scale, which is by Wood et al., which is a fairly easy to use short measure of authenticity. You know, this is an area that I'm really interested in, and I've written a qualitative paper, which I've not mentioned here, called "The Stormy Search for Self," the sort of the pursuit of authenticity in early adult crisis, where I look at people's descriptions to me from interviews about this kind of them trying to find their authentic self through crisis. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll send it's in a journal that not many people have a subscription to, so I'll send a copy to Figan after this, and you'll be welcome to circulate it. It's a nice article as well. It's one that I enjoyed writing. This is an interesting part of this study. We also said, because we were interested in curiosity and what kind of information they're seeking, what are you reading at the moment? What sort of things are you reading? And so we then found we had people who weren't in crisis and those who were, and they differed in what they were reading. And we asked them, are you reading novels, books about food, science fiction, biography, history, science, current affairs, art and architecture, self-help and spirituality and religion? So these are sort of typical book genre titles. And for the sample at age 20-35, reading 2 of these genres is associated with being in a quarter-life crisis. So in other words, that people who are in the quarter-life crisis were reading these 2 genres much more than those who weren't. So what I'll do is you can put in the chat what you think, which genres people who are having a crisis might have been reading quite a lot, and see if you get it right. So what do you think? Feel free to put it in the chat. Sabir thinks sci-fi and biography, interesting. Kuba thinks self-help and religion. Sarah thinks sci-fi, self-help. Self-help, spirituality. So yeah, I think the number 1 response so far is self-help, probably followed by spirituality. And for those of you who put that, you're right. It was those 2 that we found a big difference between the crisis and non-crisis groups. It makes perfect sense as self-help, doesn't it? You know, you're looking to change, you're looking to experiment, try new things. So you're reading books that are going to tell you about ways of developing a confidence, or of, you know, of becoming more this or that and the other. And in terms of spirituality, you know, there is something which I haven't really looked at enough yet, and I want to look at more, is that part and parcel of the quarter life crisis is an existential search. You know, what does life mean, and how do I form a relationship with that and religion or spirituality? So that's definitely a key flavor as well, and it was definitely a big part of my quarter life crisis as well. So that makes sense to me. Interestingly, for those of you who wrote biography, we found that defined midlife crisis, that people who were having a midlife crisis in their 40s and 50s were reading lots of biography compared with those who weren't. And weirdly, those who were having a later life crisis were reading books about food. And I don't know why, but yeah, I think I did speculate in the article. I can't remember what my interpretation of that was. So moving on, we're about halfway through the talk, so perfect timing. It's 3 o'clock. So qualitative findings. Now, so since about 2005, I've interviewed people who've been having quarter life crises or early adult crises about what they are experiencing or have experienced. And a bit like what we found in Robison and Wright, what's been very apparent is that people tell me lots and lots of different kinds of crisis events, but they tend to fit a fairly classic form, or two fairly classic forms, which I'll talk to you about now. And I'll give you examples of how very different stories can show the same form. Now, the first kind is the locked out crisis, which is, you know, I've got a picture of someone who's looking for a job here, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not just about that. It's about feeling locked out of society, about feeling marginalized, about feeling locked out of love and relationships. It's about this idea that there's this world of adult possibility out there, but I can't get in. And key features are feeling unable to enter adult commitments, loss of self-esteem, feelings of unwanted dependence on others, and having to ask parents for money or whatever it is, and real clear feelings of isolation and loneliness. I'm sure this went through the roof during the pandemic, as people became, you know, temporarily particularly isolated. Again, I don't have data on that, but the resolution here is becoming more embedded, is kind of breaking in to these systems of commitment and meaning, whether that's career-wise, sort of societal-wise, whether it's clubs or religious groups, or of course relationships, which are systems in themselves, and they're bigger than the self. Now, the locked-in crisis, is where the young person will have made a commitment, and which they may have expected would last a lifetime, but they realize that it's the wrong one. And I think it's extremely common to make a false start into adulthood. And the key features here are feeling stuck or trapped in a relationship, career, or lifestyle that frustrates, and then a separation from that, and while you're struggling with feelings of inauthenticity. So the resolve crisis initially is about coming out of all of that situation, which is becoming very suffocating, and then trying to develop a new, a more expressive way of living. And if you're interested, my quarter life crisis was definitely a locked-in crisis. I was kind of really quite committed by the time the crisis emerged. I was in a relationship, I was living in a house share and had a job, and ostensibly to people who weren't me probably looked like things were a success, you know, that I was making good money and everything, but it felt completely wrong internally. And I broke again. I just got rid of the whole lot and sort of started again, moved to a new part of town, left the girl, left the job, and really kind of started experimenting with different ways of being. So let's just look at these again. So in terms of the locked-in crisis, I'll go into this a bit more. It's the crisis of unwanted commitment, and it's all about the difficulties of putting down roots. I don't know if in Turkish you have that metaphor, but in English we talk about putting down roots, which is a metaphor for kind of moving from a situation where you don't have any particular commitments to a place and to people, and so can easily change and move to another part of the country or move to, and then becoming rooted is about becoming sort of situated. And the key thing about putting down roots is it means renouncing freedoms. It means saying, I'm going to renounce all these possibilities in the knowledge that I need at some point to commit to someone or something. And almost everybody does this. Not everyone does. Some may choose to remain rootless, but it does relinquish autonomy as you become part of something, and you relinquish the possibility, and you also relinquish a sense of being a sort of sovereign individual, because you have to become a part of a larger whole. And that's really difficult. And as I say, I think it's quite normal to mess it up at least once, but some people might get it right first time. But it's that sense of jumping in and then feeling that this is your life, and you're quite excited at the prospect of a committed life, and realizing that it's all wrong and have to start again. That is the kind of key feature of the locked-in crisis. And these big decisions that are being made, they can go wrong for a variety of reasons. They can be based on fear and anxiety about the future. So you say, well, I'm going to go with that option, that job, not because it's right for me, but because I'm frightened at the prospect of not having one, which is understandable, but it's not a good basis for a lifelong commitment. Introjected parental motives, it's not really what you want, it's what you think your parents want. Again, very common, but not an ideal basis for making lifelong commitments. A lot of people in crisis will describe feeling pushed around or pushed in, or like they didn't actually make the decision, that it just sort of happened to them, which is, again, far from ideal. Extrinsic motives overriding intrinsic ones. So typically, I want to be looked, I want people to think I'm a success, I want money, I want fame, or whatever it is, rather than something which I feel is going to be satisfying to me. Very common as well as young people thinking, gosh, look at all my friends, they've got here, I need to get there as well, so I'm going to do it, even though I don't think it's necessarily the right time or the right person or the right job, but I'm just concerned that I'm going to get behind. Seen all the of countless conversations and interviews where this comes up, and so this is what ends up with commitments that feel entrapping, disappointing, dissatisfying, and inauthentic. I want to emphasize that there is no perfect job and there is no perfect relationship, but it's definitely a big difference between one which is sustainable for a lifetime and one which is not. What we tend to see in quarter-life crisis is young adults who are thrashing around and trying to find the right option amongst many. And if you're lucky enough, by the time you're in midlife, like me now, I'm 46, I think, I lose track, but I don't have to make many big decisions. Everything's, things just sort of ticks along. I've got a job, I've got a kid, I've got a wife, I've got a house, and it's nice and stable. But I remember vividly what it was like being younger and having all these decisions ahead of me, and it's extraordinarily challenging. This is a way that I depict locked-in crisis graphically. So there's the person who initially feels locked in by this system that's around them, and then they separate out from that and take some time out, and then go back into an exploratory phase where they try out different things and kind of choose an unstable lifestyle for a while. And for those of you who know about emerging adulthood theory, the way that I relate this to that is that it's in emerging adulthood theory, there's all this idea about instability and deferring commitments. And then you sort of go back into that phase so you're kind of moving out of it, and then you feel, actually, no, I'm going to go back into that exploratory mode again, where I'll choose instability and trying different things. And then eventually in the post-crisis phase, there's a clear sense that there's a new commitment emerging, which is not locking in. It's allowing a kind of a movement outwards of people's values and goals. Now, in terms of the locked out crisis, there's a phase structure to that too, which I'll just read through here. This is taken from a PDF that I'll show you later. Starts off with being fired up, people who are actively seeking a job, a relationship, or a valued social role, and they're being proactive and trying hard. And then they go through repeated failures to achieve that goal, so repeated rejection, and it feels like hitting a barrier that's unexpectedly hard to get past. You just can't get it down. And so sense of frustration and self-esteem going down. And then what I find, where there is a locked out crisis that takes a resolution form, is that the person then goes, okay, enough of that. I need to stop trying trying again in the same way and try something new. So there's a pause. What are the new things that I could try? Should it be a new direction completely or a different approach? And then rescaling and resolution, a new approach, a new goal, or a different take on things. And this brings a new perspective and eventually a sense of breaking into something which allows the full transition into a kind of a committed, rooted adulthood. I'm very aware of and I mentioned this earlier on, of the similarity between what I describe as a locked out crisis, which lots of people can encounter, and the experiences of marginalization that people in disadvantaged groups can feel in this phase when they're in an environment which perhaps sort of systemically makes it harder for them to break in. And sometimes when I'm doing when I'm talking about emerging adulthood and quarter life crisis, I talk about I show students a video of a famous talk at the UN about young people and religious terrorism, because religious terrorism has been around for centuries in various forms across many religions. The only common denominator is that it's always, I say pretty much, always young men who commit the acts of terrorism, and it's not just any old young men; it's marginalized young men. And so I think that that extreme marginalization and feelings of being locked out in young adulthood amongst men are something that's very important to understand, because it can lead to radicalization and feeling very angry at the world and other people. But yeah, the fact of it being men aged between 17 and 30, whenever you hear about any new events in the news, or if you go back all the way to Guy Fawkes and the kind of Catholic terrorism that was, or Protestant terrorism that that one saw very common in the UK and other countries, some centuries back, it was always, it has always been and will always be marginalized young adult men who get moved into this space. Right, in terms of locked out crisis for university leavers, so looking at in the slightly more prosaic sense of leaving university and feeling stuck, here are some examples of people who described, yes, I'm having a locked out crisis. So someone said, it's hard because you're stuck in a position where, for me personally, I need a full-time job. I need to start enjoying life, living life how I want, but I feel like I'm stuck. There's a barrier there and I can't get it down. And this was a person who had a very good degree, a first-class degree, but just couldn't get the job that they wanted. And then someone who again, who you can see here the questioning mentality. I struggled to find a secure job in what I studied or otherwise, and I started questioning what my point in life was, sort of existential questioning. I wondered how I even managed to get a degree in something employers appeared to think I was no good in. My partner left university as well, which left me feeling very alone. And that realization that the money I got from my part-time job, which I finally managed to get, would never be enough for me to become an independent adult. And that realization was crushing. So, there's a lot in that little quote about aloneness, about being stuck, about questioning everything, and about not feeling like an independent adult. That's really, really captures a lot of this kind of crisis. Searching for employment was extremely stressful. Everyone wants experience I did not have. I suffered rejection after rejection. Felt like I would never get anywhere in life. So again, that's a classic experience. I get similar sort of descriptions when people are talking about it, relating to relationships and partner, trying to find a partner. Being dependent and responsible for myself has been challenging. So I'll tell you something that's very interesting is that there's very little research on the people who've just left university. I've been able to find very little about what happens in the year after leaving university. It's like a kind of black hole of research. It's such an important year or two after leaving university, but there's so little out there. This was one case study I did of a university leaver, which I wrote up in Emerging Adulthood a few years ago. And the article was called A Longitudinal Mixed Methods Case Study of Quarter-Life Crisis During the Post-University Transition, Locked Out and Locked In Forms in Combination. And this young woman left university. She then was interviewed by 17 times without success. And it really knocked her self-esteem, and she started feeling quite depressed, and she was really losing motivation and struggling to get out of bed. And I'll tell you what, at the same time, which I haven't put in these blue boxes, she was living with her mother. She'd not been living with her mother when she was at university, but she was living with her mother again. And her mother and her were having a lot of arguments. And this was about, they were struggling to relate as adults. The mother still wanted her to be a child. And they were really struggling to get to an adult-to-adult relationship. So there was that going on as well. So then she finally gets a job after changing her approach to doing the interviews and being more relaxed. But then in the job that she got, the boss was unpleasant and bullying, and she found that she was suddenly stuck in a commitment that she wanted to get out of. So it was from one to the other. But fortunately, there was resolution, because she was continuing to look for the better way of living. She didn't just stick, she kept changing. So she moved to a new job, and she really did a lot of work on building her personal assertiveness in terms of her ability to say no and her ability to sort of stand her ground. So you can see how a crisis can easily involve one form shifting into another. And I think that's probably not uncommon, because in the sense that if you're locked out and you're feeling, I can't get a job, or I can't find, no one seems to want to be with me, I can't find love, I feel lonely, then you might jump into something that it might not be right, but you think, well, at least I won't be here anymore. So you can see how one can lead to the other. So I produced this guide with a bank called First Direct, which is a very popular online bank, called How to Turn Your Quarter-Life Crisis into a Quarter-Life Catalyst. And they were interested because their customers are mainly young adults, and they were interested in the idea. Has anyone ever seen this? It's all over the internet. So just nod if you've seen it, or shake your head if you've not seen it before. Okay, well, but either way, it's what I'm going to just briefly mention it from this guide is that towards the end of it, I put some suggestions about what to do if you're going through a quarter-life crisis. And the key thing is that the quarter-life crisis can be as varied as someone who once described to me living with a boyfriend who was a drug dealer and who was aggressive and often threatening towards her, in a house where they were growing marijuana, and there was only one room which wasn't full of marijuana plants. And so she felt completely oppressed by the domestic situation and her difficult boyfriend, and then left, and actually of all places went to Turkey and so she left the UK and went to Turkey and got a qualification as a what's called a TEFL qualification, teaching English in a foreign language, and she was a waitress before. Complete life change, but it was a classic locked-in crisis. So you can have something where someone's very disadvantaged and in a very difficult social position, all the way through to people who, you know, ended up being a highly paid banker and then decide that they hate it and they're going to break out and try something else. It's the same stuff, it's the same dynamics and the same kinds of help that can be suggested. So here's a few of them. So the key thing I try and emphasize in this guide and elsewhere is that if you think you want to make changes, start small. Don't bail out of the relationship or the job or whatever it is yet. So firstly, you know, the one thing you can't do is just carry on doing what you're doing. Change is essential. So take a couple of hours and make a list of everything in your life you're not satisfied with. For all the things on your list, set out 2 things you can try out to see if changing that direction makes a difference to you, and then let's just commit to one or both of them. Have a go. Explore what you might have lost from your past. So the first decade of adult life is full of time pressures and stresses. And as you push to achieve your goals, you can often drop things from your life that are crucial to your well-being, such as a hobby or a sport or art. It can help in this situation to recall and write down what used to be fun, bring fun and positivity to your life when you were younger, and then work out a plan to devote some time to it each week. Do you know, this is so common in this sort of rush for success and becoming someone in young adult life, that important elements of what makes for a good life get dropped and need to be rescued. You know, we completely understand that for children to be happy, they need to be intellectually stimulated, they need good schooling, they need exercise, they need to be outside for, you know, enough time, and they need music and art as well. You know, every education system in the world includes music, art, exercise, and intellectual pursuits. But somehow we kind of think that adults can make do without all those things, but I don't think they can. And then read about quarter-life crisis. Try and learn about what goes on during it, what people kind of experience. Learn that you're not alone, that this is quite normal, and get a sense of where you might be in the process. Try speaking to others about your problems. It's not just simply that it helps to offload, but people can give you some ideas about what to do next. Then there's the financial side of things. It's quite common to have debt worries in this time, so get financial advice if that's appropriate. We saw in the tables earlier on that debt was very common financial concerns. Try volunteering. This is a great way of bringing back meaning to life if you find your job is not providing enough. And I'll tell you what I did when I had my quarter-life crisis. Which is an interesting decision. I volunteered in a hospice. And I don't know if you've got hospices in Turkey, but they're places where you take someone if they are terminally ill, so that they're definitely going to die, and they will probably die in the hospice. So I decided to volunteer in a place where all the people who have been brought there are terminally ill. And that's, well, all I can say is that, you know, if you put yourself in a situation where you become much more aware of your own mortality, it actually kind of helps in making decisions and deciding what you should do with your life. I think it helped me. It wasn't easy, but the whole process wasn't easy. And start small before making any big decisions. Try new things on a small scale on a temporary basis and see how it goes and see how you feel. You know, all journeys start with a single step. So this is a radio program that was done a while back, but it remains very popular. So do check it out. I've sent the slides to Vegan, so you have all of these links, etc. And there's the PDF guide, which you can also find just via Google search. Just Google quarter-life crisis first direct. That's my website, oliverrobinson.info, and my book, Development Through Adulthood, which talks about this and many other things. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. You shared a lot of research results, and I'm very much impressed. You used qualitative and quantitative data to understand this very complicated issue. So thank you very much. I'm sure our participants will have some questions or
I hope
comments.
so. Please do fire away
And
with any questions or comments.
among participants, 3 of them already conducted their master's thesis on quarter life crisis.
Right.
Okay, questions and comments. Who wants to ask or contribute? Okay, let's start with Kübra. Kübra Berber.
Hi, thank you, Professor Robinson, for your presentation. I'm so excited, so forgive me if I make any mistakes or blush too much. So I conducted a dissertation about quarter life crisis, and in my study, I've found that Turkish emerging adults receiving a lot of support from their parents. Like in our culture, it's really not a thing to leave parents' house immediately to become an adult, and no one is forcing you to leave their house. So they provide you financial support, they provide you emotional support, and my participants were feeling a lot better in this transition process while having a quarter life crisis, because they were receiving support from their families. If they are receiving support, of course, they were people who does not receive that much support. So I was thinking if culture has an effect on this type of crisis. I know it's the developmental crisis, so it needs to be evrensel. Hocam.
Universal.
Universal. Sorry, I forgot the English of this word. So, but I was just wondering, and there's another thing. In Turkey, I know that the world is going through an economic struggle right now due to pandemic, and but in Turkey we are going through a little bit harder. So there are a lot of unemployed people, and the rates of needs, neither in employment or in education or in training, rates are really high in Turkey, highest in Europe. So I was wondering if this could be something that makes it harder for them to transition to university, to I don't know, job. So I was wondering if that could be something affecting their quarter life crisis experience, maybe makes it harder for them. So it's the same thing actually. Like I'm wondering if culture or context has an influence over quarter life crisis. What do you think?
Okay. Thank you very much. So in response to your question, does culture shape the way in which quarter life crisis is experienced and the way that it's best dealt with? The answer is definitely. So yeah, so the key thing is the nature of this crisis is one which involves the individual situated within a variety of social and economic systems, and it's like it's kind of like it's like Russian dolls, sort of concentric rings, and you can feel a sense of empowerment or entrapment relating to very small scale things like your relationship, but also to your country as a whole. In relation to the, to, as you say, economic circumstances that may prevent, make getting a job very difficult or something like that. So culture and socioeconomic circumstances and national culture, all these things certainly come to bear. What's been very interesting is the way in which that some of the features of quarter life crisis seem to be common across the whole world. I get a lot of interest from Singapore and India and places like that, and they seem to report very similar experiences. But your point about kind of the relationship with the parents is really, really interesting. What I would contend is that for all young adults, whether you're going through a quarter-life crisis or not, a vital developmental task is moving from a parent to child relationship with your parents to an adult to adult relationship, which is more equitable and more horizontal. That has to be done effectively. But that can certainly be done while living in the parental home, if both parties are willing to make those changes. And actually in the UK at the moment, more and more young adults are living at home with their parents as well, because the housing in this country is becoming incredibly expensive, and it's so expensive that it's almost it's making living independently very, very difficult, particularly in London. So we have lots of young people living at home. When I did my research with graduates, it's a study I didn't mention here, but I did a study of graduates where I followed them for a year. And in the UK, those who were living at home were not as happy as those who'd moved out. But there's lots of reasons why that could be, and it might be completely different in Turkey. It'd be fascinating to see if you followed a bunch of graduates in Turkey and compared their residential circumstances. Maybe we'd find something completely different. So all the more reason for lots of international research and multicultural research. So thank you. Yeah, we've got a hand up from, is it Safak? Apologies if I pronounced your name wrong.
Thank you very much. And the next question is coming from Shafak.
Shafak.
Hello, everyone. Actually, I'm in the middle of the lockdown crisis, but in the exploration phase. Last September, I also quit my job. And your works and my other Turkish friends, Figen Hocam, their works helped me a lot to better understand myself and my situation. And I read all of the articles about the quarter life crisis. And I wondered that, actually I heard that inner voice coming from me, change your situation, change your work, but I didn't listen because of the my company was one of the well-known company in Turkey, and some other friends or my family say that there is no perfect job, you have to stay there. And suddenly my body shows some signs in terms of my stomachache and my colons. We couldn't find any physical reasons for it. And one of the doctor at the end said that this is a spastic colon, and it is source of the stress. And I wonder that, is there any publication about the quarter life crisis with the somatic symptoms of the people? Because
fascinating question.
Young people maybe live that somatic experiences, and it is reason for it most of the time actually anxiety, I guess.
Yeah, I'm aware of all the literature that looks at the relationship between stress and somatic symptoms. And also there's fascinating research on stress and immunity as well. I don't know if are you aware of the work of Sheldon Cohen, who does these fascinating immunity challenge experiments. And I'll give you an example. It's slightly off the topic. I'll come back to your point back in a minute. But what he does is that he gets a group of people, typically young adults, and then he puts them in a sort of secluded space, like a sealed off hotel or something like that. And then all of them gets a virus squirted up their nose, whether it's a rhinovirus or a coronavirus or a flu virus. So they all get exposed to a high dose of virus, and then some of them stay completely well, show no symptoms whatsoever, and some get ill. And one of the biggest predictors of getting ill is stress. So there is self-reported stress in those participants. So, so stress is something that is vital in terms of staying well. And as you say, it's vital in a range of other somatic symptoms, whether that's gastrointestinal, etc. As far as I'm aware, there is no research yet that looks at the relationship between crisis and somatic symptoms. But it would be one that I'd be fascinated to do. And again, the new psychometric measure would lend itself pretty well to that. I do remember when I was doing one interview, I don't know why this one particular interview kind of comes up to me, and I was speaking to this woman who is an extremely successful, she was an extremely successful lawyer as a young adult, and she was making a lot of money, and there was a huge pressure on her to not leave that job for various reasons. And she said that she developed terrible headaches, and she felt like there was this sort of pillar of heat coming out of her head. And as soon as she finally left the job and broke out of an environment which was fundamentally making her ill, she was written mentally and physically, all of the symptoms went away, the headaches went away, and she could. So in a qualitative sense, I kind of hear this stuff all the time, but I think it'd be great to look at the relationship quantitatively as well. So Shafak, before you left the job, how are you feeling in your mind, in your emotions?
Actually, I was feeling a bit guilty because Turkey also one of the guilt and shame culture. There are a lot of things, but in that times I read Jonathan Livingston Seagull book.
All right, yeah.
It helped me a lot to push my limits, actually, and I accepted PhD degree from one of the universities. So I feel encouraged, but my husband helped me a lot to do that. And one healthy person is very effective for changing the situation, I guess. And I have extra question, if you don't.
Sure.
Is there any correlation between perfectionism and the quarter life crisis? Do you think so? Because some perfectionist people also think like black or white, and they maybe feel more pressure to stay that locked in on lockout crisis.
Yeah. So I don't have any data on perfectionism. Something that I hypothesized, I think it was all the way back in my PhD thesis, was that a combination, kind of a personality which is perfectionistic, or certainly has a sort of high achievement need, but also a high need for approval, may from others, may create a sort of personality type that might be quite prone to crisis. Insofar as I think if someone is the kind of person who doesn't have a particularly strong sense of what they want to do with their life, then whatever circumstance they end up in might be fine. They just think, well, I'll just get along. But if someone has a strong sense of what they want to do, they have an ambition or a calling, but they also kind of find that they tend to make decisions that might not be exactly aligned with what they want, but more perhaps what other people want, that those two things can combine. There's a kind of famous phrase or quote in English, which is that you have to be fired up to burn out. And I think that sometimes you tend to find that if you find someone who's just been through a crisis, that they have that might be a sort of symptom of the fact that they have a really strong sense of what life should be like, or what the life could be like, and that's a positive. So I think that that going through a developmental crisis brings potential growth that would occur over a much longer period of time if without a crisis. So anyway, that's a sort of long, rambling answer to your question there. Anyway, any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Shafak. You shared your private experience. I think Kübra has another question. How much time you have, Oliver?
I think probably another 5 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Another question. So if there's anyone who wants to ask question, I can give the
Time.
I was just
Okay.
going to say that Dr. Robinson, I've sent you an email a couple of months ago about the mental crisis questionnaire to well. I ask your permission to adapt the scale into Turkish. So
Oh,
if
good.
you want to, we will be delighted to conduct a prevalence study with that scale.
Excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, I've got there's really interesting. This since that questionnaires come out, I've been approached by people in the Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and yourselves in Turkey, wanting to translate it and interested in collaborating. So, my idea is to try and get data from all of those countries and then compile it into a single kind of cross-cultural comparison study. So yeah, if you'd be interested in getting involved, that's great. Then I will be in touch within the next few weeks or the next month or so.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there any other question or comment? Kübra has a question.
Not a question, but Dr. Robinson, thank you so much for sharing your valuable information with us today. I'm a research assistant working with Professor Çok. Listening to you was very fascinating for me. I follow your work with a great interest. I studied quarter life crisis with my master thesis, and I'm still continuing my academic research on this. As someone who is 27, I living through quarter life crisis deeply, and my experiences keep me interested in quarter life crisis. I want to thank you again for being here with us today. I hope we can meet and have a chat face to face someday. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Well, thank you, and I hope so too. Figen, why don't you tell me a bit about the conference you mentioned, and I'll tell you a bit about the one I've got in mind.
Okay, it's May 18 to 20. Müge Artar, my colleague here, is the conference chair, and it will take place in one of the wonderful huts of the world, Cappadocia.
Oh, wow.
Have you heard about Cappadocia?
Somewhere I've always wanted to go.
Yeah, so you may think about attending. Actually, we first planned to invite you as conference organizers, but due to financial limitations, we couldn't do that. But you are welcome to join us. I will send you right after the meeting the announcement from email or WhatsApp. Okay.
Right. Well, good. I mean, so the conference that I'm involved with is the weekend before, and I'll just put the link in the chat now. It's a very long link, but hopefully it works. Yeah. And you'll see that it's the weekend before, and it's an adult development conference, and we're going to be hosting it in Greenwich. But it may well be that if you're all involved in the Cappadocia conference the next weekend, that's not possible. But do have a think about it, and I recommend that you all, if you all join.
We would love to come. But traveling to UK after having this high inflation is becoming more and more difficult.
I bet it is. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, so your membership of the European Society for Research and Adult Development, which I'm president, is free. So if you're not a member, do join up and you get information about, you can share your research and hear about other people's work and get information about conferences. And then there is if you can't make it to the conference but would like to hear the keynote, Dan McAdams' talk, then there's an option to join online for his talks. It's just it's 30 euros to listen to his talk and listen to the interview with him, and that will be fully online. And I don't know if you're aware of Dan. He's an amazing guy. He's got about 100,000 citations. He's a very high level researcher in the area of adult development and narrative research. So and someone who's kind of really crossed the boundary in terms of qualitative and quantitative research as well. But anyway,
okay,
so
thank you very much
I look
for
forward
this
to hearing more about
information.
yours too.
Thank you very much for this information. We'll try to take part at least in the online session, which is a great opportunity for us. And have you seen a note by Müge? Who is the conference chair, wrote a note for you. She invites you to Cappadocia another time when you want to come.
Okay, great. Well, as I say, send me all the information and I'll see if I can make it. It'd be lovely.
Okay, we will write you about it. Okay,
That'd be
so
wonderful.
much.
Thank
Right.
you.
All right, I have to go, but it's been a pleasure, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you very much, and good night, good evening.
All right, bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Çok teşekkürler arkadaşlar. Çok güzel bir oturumdu, değil mi? Oturum da
Evet.
denmez de
Ben
buluşmaydı.
kaydı kapatıyorum şimdi.